Hello and welcome to this session on defining the leadership of tomorrow. I'm Michael Hocking, Deputy Editor of HRD Connect. I have two expert panelists here today to discuss two things really. First of all, what is the role of the leader in the current crisis we're facing and the ongoing pandemic we're in the midst of right now? What should leaders be doing? Should we be encouraging? What should we not be encouraging perhaps? But also going forward, after this crisis is over, what should we be encouraging leaders after that? How can leaders be shaping businesses well into the future? I'm going to introduce each of our panelists first, and then we're going to start with a few questions for around about half an hour. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Chuck Heaton, Senior HR Consultant at Talent IQ. Chuck, would you mind introducing yourself?
Thank you. Appreciate the introduction. It's a great honor to be part of this panel and talking about issues that are so critical at this time, especially around leadership and the things that we're seeing within how people are reacting to this crisis and the things that leaders are doing to help people through this. And it's such a relevant topic for this time, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate.
Fantastic. And I'm also joined by DeRetta Rhodes, SVP People Capital at the Atlanta Braves. DeRetta, please introduce yourself.
Hi there, DeRetta Rhodes. Hi there, everyone. DeRetta Rhodes, and I'm with the Atlanta Braves. And I'm really excited to have this conversation. There's so many things that are going on that all organizations are looking at, thinking about. And so the fact that we are able to at least have this dialogue, I think is really exciting.
Fantastic. Exciting it is as well. And if I can point out actually briefly before we start, so you went to opposing colleges, is that right? Initially, there's some kind of rivalry here, which I don't want to stoke, but is that the case?
That's correct. Myself, I went to Auburn University, which is part of the Southeastern Conference, and DeRetta went to the University of Georgia, which is part of the Southeastern Conference. And if you know your college football history, Auburn and Georgia have the oldest rivalry in the South. So it's if you're from the Southeastern United States, college football is almost like a religion, almost as much as baseball is a religion in the U.S. So it's a very intense, passionate rivalry that pits brothers against brothers, cousins against cousins, etc. So but it makes for a fun discussion whenever you get together with people from the SEC.
Fantastic. Okay, well, without further ado, then let's get started. So, Chuck, I'll direct the first question to you. What do you think is the leader's role then in the current crisis we're facing?
The leader's role right now is really getting out in front of what's going on and how the company is going to react to the crisis, setting the tone and tenor for communications, setting what the direction is going to be, setting a tone of transparency within the organization that, hey, these are the realistic business conditions. These are the things that we're going to have to do moving forward. All the remote work that is happening and how managers and employees are reacting to that. You have a window into people's homes, and so it's a different kind of dynamic that you're dealing with, but also that the separation that the virtual connection provides makes it more critical for managers to be utilizing that EQ, that emotional quotient IQ, where to try to make sure they're staying connected with their teams and what the impact the crisis is having on them.
DeRetta, what do you make of that? How do you feel the leader's role is being shaped in the current crisis?
I'd like to add on to what Chuck talked about. I think outside of just all of those things, people are looking at leaders for a calming perspective around this, because the reality is that there's nothing that's calm about how you're dealing with any of this. You're dealing with family challenges. You're dealing with people having to be in the same location all of the time with each other, where that wasn't the case before. So I think a level of calmness to just provide around how we're moving forward, what are the things that we need to think about. I think the other piece to that is really critically important is mindfulness. And when I think about mindfulness, I think about, and again, Chuck talked about it, you're now peeked into people's homes because they're working from home, and it looks very different than how they probably show up for work. And so having mindfulness around all of the things that are just not a singular binary of just work. Because, we always talk about people bringing their whole selves to work. We always talk about people being whole at work. Well, the reality is that that's how we're operating now. And really, leaders need to be able to guide their staff, their employees, their own leaders on how you make this a palatable situation for staff and for leaders alike that are going through this at the same time.
Fantastic. Both of you there, both interestingly mentioned things around emotions there, which is it's great that you kind of both, I suppose, went to that place initially. But DeRetta, if I could carry on with you just for a moment, how do you think we can help leaders to connect emotionally then with their teams? How can we? Because for some leaders, this could be a totally new scenario where they think, how on earth do I do that with so many people?
And what I would say to you is, I think, as we've always said before, over communication is something that you always want to do. Now you've got to think about communicating in a very different way. So, for example, we've had our executive leadership team come and do a virtual town hall where we took Q&A and we responded back to that Q&A in a written email form. We are sending out something on a regular basis as it aligns with the conversation that's coming out from MLB and all of the things that are happening around baseball. And I think that when you're able to provide information, although you're not providing answers, because we don't have answers right now, but if you're providing information, that provides a level of comfort I think people end up having. I'll give another example. It's around the changes in benefits and things that we can provide to our staff that's very different than we've done before. We're not an organization that's a work from home organization. We like to be around each other. I mean, we do sports entertainment. And so the fact that we're trying to make sure we connect, and we have a part of our team that does Beat Brigade. And so we're doing different activities with each of our staff virtually, like a scavenger hunt in your house and how you can get awards for doing that. And so we're trying to figure out a way in every aspect for us to connect our staff with our leadership.
Fantastic. Chuck, what do you make of this? How do you think we can help leaders to emotionally connect in that way?
Yeah, I think the role that HR a lot of times plays for operational leaders is to be that conduit to help leaders understand what the organization is feeling, the emotions that are pulsing through it. A lot of times, especially in a situation like this, it's okay to show humanity. People are challenged, they're struggling, they have family that is remote, they have people that are being impacted, by this crisis. But, I think another unique aspect of what's going on right now is a lot of times when we have a crisis, a hurricane, a tornado, it impacts a certain section of the country or a certain country in the world. But this time around, almost uniquely in our lifetimes, this is a crisis that's impacting everywhere. And for organizations that are multi-country, multicultural, there are some very unique challenges on how the organization can communicate broadly to impact and empathize with what's going on in every different country, because countries obviously are impacted differently. But I think it's a unique opportunity to bring people together because they are challenged in the same way with what's going on in this crisis. So if leaders can tap into that emotion like we talked about earlier, and some of the things that DeRetta talked about is showing that, to me, it's showing humanity. I mean, whether it's being creative on, you're having different theme calls on Zoom or a scavenger hunt or something more virtual, I think it's a license to be creative, which can really unleash some powerful cultural things that maybe your organization hasn't had before. And the ability for leaders to allow this remote work to happen, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this a little bit later, I think it's going to have a real impact on the future of how organizations manage and utilize brick and mortar structures going forward. So I think it provides a lot of unique opportunities if an organization is willing to tap into that.
Wow, there's so much to unpack there. And I think you're right. There are so many different things that you can take out of this in a creative way and try to be more creative, I suppose, in different aspects of leadership. But so, okay, looking forward then, okay, let's think about the traits then that we want to take in this situation in creating leaders, and then going forward, once things are cleared up and things are not so crazy, what are the traits that we want to engender in leaders going forward? So perhaps maybe the emotional side of things. Chuck, if you'd like to start first on this one, what do you think are the other traits that we want to continue to develop in leaders following on from this that maybe come to the fore during this situation?
Yeah, I think a key thing is, one of the key competencies is trust. I mean, with organizations working more remotely, leaders have to trust that things are happening, that their managers, their supervisors are making things happen within the organization. And I think that is a key thing going forward, is the willingness of leaders to empower and trust that things are going to happen without having them all confined to one space, having them confined to one building. I think that's a whole different mindset that leaders need to get their heads around to make organizations successful. And I think you're going to see workers, as things somewhat get back to normal, workers are going to say, hey, I worked from home for 4 weeks in a row and I got all these projects done. Let's figure out a way to make a more flexible working schedule and make a better experience for everyone. So it's going to create a lot of different things, I think, going forward. And leaders are going to have to get their minds around that these things are going to happen, and we're going to a natural evolution, so to speak. And I think in some ways it's accelerating these things happening. An interesting comment I heard this morning talking with a peer of mine was, leaders are going to have to be prepared to be unprepared, to be prepared that things that they were not expecting are going to happen. And how you deal with that and how you react to it is going to be very key going forward.
I think that's a fantastic point you make, especially around trust. And what like you say about the working from home aspect of that, is there are so many different things that up until now that we were told, or employees were told, that's not how we do things. That's not business as usual. We don't really let people work that way. Whereas now, I think it's going to totally change the playing field and how things operate. I think that's a really, really good point. DeRetta, what do you think? What are perhaps the other traits that leaders are going to have to develop going forward now, and what should we encourage?
So the one thing I know that we've always talked about, and we've managed to say that business continuity was important in case something happened. I think we can pivot that now and call it disruption. And so from the standpoint of the fact that leaders really need to think about not just business continuity, but disruption, and how output is very different within a disrupting environment. So my perspective is that leaders are really going to have to pivot again and think very differently. And I think I just kind of echo what Chuck said around the fact that it is going to be very, very critical for us to take this opportunity to learn around what are the things that we need to provide for organizations for them to be able to both pivot and have adaptability in these type of environments. I think the other thing that is going to be critically important is that at the end of the day, when you think about what's happened with COVID-19, it's basically created a situation where we've had to slow our pace. We don't have a choice. Slow our pace in so many different ways. Slow our pace in how we even buy groceries. Slow our pace in how we engage with our family members and friends. And I think when everything spins back up, because, you know, as working in a baseball organization, we want that to happen. But I do believe that we're going to have to view disruption as a part of business now, and how we assist, help, and guide our staff, our employees, and our leaders through disruption.
I think that's a fantastic point, DeRetta. A few things you said there, particularly on disruption, are very interesting. And as you say, I think the new normal going forward, as it seems, is going to be this mindset of constant change and flux and disruption. But one thing I think that's really key to consider is how are we going to create those leaders with these traits going forward? How are we going to help current leaders to to put those traits to the fore, but also the next generation of leaders that are following on from this. There'll be people in business now, younger people maybe, who are going through the COVID-19 pandemic at the start of their careers, and they're one day going to be the business leaders are going to be shaping the future. How on earth do we create those leaders of the future? Or do you think maybe going through this process is going to create an entirely new generation of leaders? But DeRetta, what do you think? How can we create the leaders we want to see going forward?
I think if you look at every generation that they've gone through something that has been that has been major, that has created them and the culture of that particular generation. And so I think about my sons who were very young when 9/11 occurred, but it did impact them in a certain way. I think this particular occurrence for this generation is going to impact how they look at work, how they look at health benefits. I think it is going to really change people's perspective around how you even look at community and how you support one another in community. I know that we've always talked in our country around different health phenomena that have occurred, but this one, and I will have to just say, Chuck mentioned this one, it didn't halt a part of the region of the country, it halted the country. And I think everyone is viewing and seeing that. And I think the generation that's behind us, my sons that are in college and getting ready to graduate, that is going to impact the type of leaders that they decide to become. It is going to make them, I believe, have a larger EQ and have a better understanding of how you connect around the world and how impacts of different situations occur. And it doesn't just impact a region, it impacts the whole world. And I think that's one of the probably best things that is happening in this particular phenomena. It's going to create leaders that are going to be much more expansive around how we need to think about business, how we need to think about healthcare, how we need to think about world issues.
That's a fascinating idea that even through coming up through this situation can create this wider scope in terms of mindset. Chuck, what do you think in terms of creating that new generation of leaders? Responding to what DeRetta said, do you have any thoughts about how that might come about?
Yes, I completely agree with DeRetta. I think about, and she mentioned this earlier, for a lot of us, 9/11 was 20 years ago, but it was a pivot point for a lot of us around security and the impact it had on travel and organizations. And, for some of us in the Southeast, Katrina was another seminal moment. Harvey for us in Texas and Houston in particular was a huge pivot point. And so when you have that experience and that impact of having to live through those crises, having to help lead organization or advise leaders through that, you develop some muscle memory. And I'm seeing some of those things being put to use as we're going through this crisis today. So I totally agree with DeRetta's point that we're really developing leaders right now because they're having to adapt, be flexible. They're having to communicate in a way that they've probably never communicated to their employees before. They're having to try to empathize in a way that they've never had that experience of developing before. I've heard some of my peers talk about they were doing some training for supervisors because they weren't around the last time we went through a downturn in the industry around the financial crisis in 2008. So it is a new experience for a lot of the younger leaders and managers and supervisors who've never dealt with this before. And we're literally developing a new brand of leaders who are going to live through this crisis and be better for it because they've had to adapt and be different, whether it's through virtual work, Zoom calls, or trying to connect and manage a dispersed workforce. And I think it's an opportunity for talent managers in particular to see who's rising to the top, who are the best people at adapting to this new normal and effectively leading their organizations through the crisis.
Fantastic. Coming off something you said there, But coming back to the present, I think, a little bit, rather than looking that far forward, there's going to be a bit of a teething period, I think, after this, where things are sort of coming to normal, but something has to change. Things are a little bit in flux. So we've talked a bit about how we can create those leaders, but how can we help those leaders to create the businesses that we want to see? How can we help them to change and transform organizations, perhaps in the shorter term? Once things start to settle down, there's going to be a lot of changes that need to take place. What's the solution here in terms of shaping those leaders? Is it learning? Is it the more processes that we need to put in place? Chuck, what do you think about that?
Well, I think one of the key things will be organizations willing to kind of do an after-action report, so to speak, or do an analysis on, okay, how did we react over the last several weeks or months in the crisis? What were the good things we did? What were the not so good things that we did? How effective were our communications? How did we, how effective was our IT infrastructure in being able to handle this? And what are the things that we need to do going forward to improve crisis communications, IT infrastructure, remote working, video chatting, performance management? I think a key thing for leaders in how do you manage a dispersed workforce or remote workforce is how do you manage performance? How do you set expectations? How do you effectively communicate what those are, but also to adapt them to the ever-changing needs? And change is just happening so much more rapid in the workforce and in the environment today that we have to abandon some of our old tried and true processes and procedures. Utilize systems, HRIS systems, going to have to be more robust to be able to support that kind of dispersed work. So I think organizations need to be reflective and adaptive to the things that they learn that are happening over the last several weeks for them.
Fantastic. DeRetta, what do you make of this in terms of helping those leaders to change businesses and reshape businesses in that way? How can we help empower them to do so?
I want to add on to what Chuck talked about. I think one of the things, and we always speak the buzzwords, one of them being agile. And I think one of the things that we're going to have to do is become very proficient in agility. And what do I mean by that? I mean the fact that, and I'll give you an example, we're not, as I had mentioned before, a work from home organization. Within 3 days, we had to make sure that we had a work from home environment so that we could still have sustainability of doing business very quickly. So I think if you're talking about short term and near term, what are organizations going to have to think about? Going to have to basically operationalize any agility perspective, any agility plans that they had talked about and put them in place. Because the reality is that things are moving on a dime. I'll give you another example. So we have essential staff that's at our locations. And at one point in time, they had indicated that individuals did not need to have face masks. Unless you were ill, you did not need to have face masks. And that shifted. And that shifted in a matter of days, where then we had to be agile enough to figure out how to ensure our staff had face masks. So I think, and that's just a small example of giving a larger scope of what agility needs to look like. But I think as we go through these next few weeks, and I think as we spin back up and we go to a new normalcy that's different than what today is, that's probably more what we've seen before with adaptation, I think it really is going to be critical for us to speak to agility and how we do that in both the near term and short term.
Amazing. This conversation, I feel, could go on for quite a long time. I think there's a lot we could dive into on this, but I'm afraid we are running out of time. So lastly, the very last thing I'll ask is from both of you is if a leader is watching this and they're totally at sea and they feel I have no idea what to do to help my workforces through this crisis and what's going to happen in months down the line, maybe a year down the line, who knows. If you could give one piece of advice to leaders watching who are just totally at sea and don't know how to approach the current situation, what would that be? DeRetta, if you wouldn't mind going first, what would that piece of advice be?
I think the reality is everybody's feeling the same way. And if you show as a leader vulnerability in this time and transparency with that vulnerability, it goes a long way. Because I think people want to see a human connection as to not only are you feeling that way, but they're feeling the same way. And I think that having the ability to be vulnerable during this time and to show that is very critical to help individuals, again, as I had mentioned earlier, help them to stay calm and to work our way back through what this situation is, and to just trust in each other. A word that I want to use that Chuck said is just trust as we go through these times.
Thank you so much, DeRetta. And Chuck, lastly from you, what would your piece of advice be to those leaders watching who are just totally lost and feel like they need some guidance?
Yeah, I think DeRetta made some great comments. I would just add on to the top of that about communications and the empathy that you inject into those communications, showing people that you can be human, that you are impacted just as much as they are, that you don't know what's going to happen in a lot of ways just as much as they don't know, because the future's uncertain right now. We're not sure when the end of this crisis is going to occur. And we just have to show that we're connecting, that we're empathetic, and that we're transparent in what's going on, and that we're going to adapt the organization to whatever comes forward, and we're going to get through this together. I think you have to have some inspiration of hope. Hey, we're going to figure this out, and we're going to get through this together. Those are powerful words, and if people hear that from their leadership, they're going to believe it. And I think that's so critical right now for leaders in any organization.
An inspiring note to end on there, Chuck. Thank you so much, Chuck Heaton and DeRetta Rhodes, for joining me for this session. I hope you watching have found it as insightful as I have. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. Stay tuned, everyone watching, for some more from the HRD Summit in just a moment. Thank you so much, guys.